Okay. So we're up to here on 18b. That's what we're up to, 18b. Sure, we're up to 18b. And we're going to learn some more halachas of the Mishnah that we had, the earlier Mishnah. We're going to learn some more halachas. And just make sure. And the Gemara is going to go on from here, and hopefully we can finish today till the next Mishnah. Okay, so we're up to the Gemara on 18b, Tanu Rabban. Okay, this is a brisa. So what does it say in the brisa? Hishmit bo soifer ois oy pesukim. Let's say that the scribe skipped a letter or some pesukim. He wrote a Megillah, but the Megillah is missing some letters, or it's missing some verses. So what happens there? Rashi says, Hishmit, dileg bo ha-soifer pasuk echad. If the soifer skipped one pasuk, and what happens? The Koran HaKoyret. So the reader did read it. So what do you mean did he read it? If it's not there, how could he read it? If it's skipped, if there's no letters there, there's no words there, there's no pasuk there. It's interesting that Rashi says pasuk echad. In the Gemara it says letters, ois yois. It says psukim in a plural. Rashi says if the scribe skipped one pasuk and he read it, I'm not sure what's the emphasis, only one pasuk versus psukim. I'm not sure if this is a Rashi's trying to teach us that this would be only one pasuk, not then more one pasuk. I'm not sure, but here it says psukim, meaning psukim. I don't know, maybe one pasuk in every parak or one. Not sure what we got to look it up. This has been debated more, but in any event, so how did we read it? So the Gemara v'koram hakoyde kimeturgemon hametargim. And the reader read it just like the translator who translated. What does that mean? What does that mean? That means the olden days, what they would have is they would have a person that he would read, and the other person would be the translator. So one person would read, and the other person would be the translator. The translator didn't read from inside. He is basically a translator. So you have the big rabbi, he would read, and then he would read it for the people. So that means kimeturgamon hametargim. Yeah, I'm in the middle of class now. Yeah, you can't find it? Hold on 1 second. Yeah. Let me put you guys on hold for a minute over here. Okay. So this translator that we were talking about, he was translating it by heart. So that's why we're saying over here, oh, why is this doing this? Okay, that's why we're saying over here that Yotza, that he actually fulfilled his obligation. Basically, it means reading a verse or a few letters by heart. If the Megillah is missing a few letters and you read it by heart, that's okay. That's basically what we're saying over here. That reading the Megillah, one pasuk or one word, a few letters, if it's missing, it's okay for the Baal Korah to read it by heart. He doesn't have to have all the verses in there. That would be okay. So, frag the Gemara, Meisve, but I'll challenge you that. How could you say that it's okay to read the Megillah if it's missing a verse or letters? This is what it says in another brayso. If it had scribbled letters, the letters were not clear. They were sort of scratched off. They're not clear letters. Or it was actually ripped. The parchment is ripped so that the letters, you can't see the letters well on the parchment. So what is the law? Im rishumon niker kesheda. If there is a mark left over, then it's kosher. So you have to have a mark left over. If there is no mark left over and it's totally scrambled or it's totally ripped that you can't make out, there's not even a mark left from the letter, then it's not kosher. Im rishumon niker kesheda. If the mark is recognizable, it's kosher. V'im lav, and if it's not, it's pesula. It's not kosher. So here you see that at least you need there to be a mark left over. By us, there was not such a requirement to have a mark. Over here we said, if you're missing the letter or you're missing a pasuk, that would already be qualified to still a kosher Megillah. As long as you read it by heart, that would be a kosher Megillah. The Gemara says, Loi kashya. This is not a question from the other brayso, because over there, when it says that it's pasul, ha bekula, this is talking about all of the Megillah. If the whole Megillah is scrambled and it's ripped, over there you needed to have recognizable the letters. But by us, we say if it's missing a verse or missing some letters, we're talking about b'miktsasa. We're talking partially. Partially is a different story. That will be okay. Again, you see the difference is all or partially. Rashi says one pasuk. Again, what exactly is partially? How much of it? I mean, those things have to be looked at further. But the Gemara says when the brayso says that you have to have the letters recognizable, the mark left over, that's if all of it is sort of scratchy, all of it is ripped, or then you need, or if we're talking about just a pasuk, then it would be okay that it's missing totally. Now the brayso brings down another halacha. So what happens if the person misses a verse? He misses a verse. So what should he do? Should he go back to the verse that he missed or let him finish the Megillah? And then he'll make up that verse. You know, some people come into Shachris and they missed out some of the davening and the minyan is davening. So they'll go with the minyan and they'll daven and then they'll go back and they'll catch up what they missed out before. But with the Megillah, if you had one verse that did not match, he said like this, Hishmit ba hakoyde pasuk echad. If he skipped He missed out one pasuk. Now, I don't know if it means he missed out in the Megillah, like he didn't write there a pasuk, and now he doesn't know the pasuk by heart, or the reader, but it's mashma the lashon hishmit bo. He slipped out in it. It looks like in the parchment of the Megillah that he slipped out, but then it says hakoidem. So we're talking about the reader. So the reader, maybe in what he was reading, he missed out one verse. So lo yoimar, he shouldn't say, ekras kulo, let me read the entire Megillah, and then I'll read that verse. Don't say so. Don't say, let me finish the rest. So the reader missed out one pasuk. So he's going to say, let me finish the rest of the Megillah, and then I'll read that verse. If you miss the pasuk, go back to that pasuk and start from that pasuk and on. Same thing is, what happens? It happens all the time. People come in late for the Megillah reading. So they think, you know what? Let me hear from the point where the chazan is till the end, or with the one who's reading the Megillah till the end. And then later on, I'll make up. So he comes in half. And then he says, let me read now half. And then when I'll come in later, I'm going to read the other half. So he says, Nichnas lebeis hakneses. If he enters the shul, Nichnas lebeis hakneses, he enters the shul. Umotza tzibur shekaru chetzyo. He finds a minyan that has read half of the Megillah. Lo yoimar, he shouldn't say, ekra chetzyo im hatzibur. Let me read the half with the minyan. Then I'll make up and read the other half. Doesn't work that way. You have to read it from the beginning to the end. Can't just read that part, then go back. You have to start from the beginning. So if you came late to shul, you're going to have to do over the entire Megillah reading. You can't just read a part of the Megillah. You have to do the whole thing. Okay. Basically, this is actually the halacha we learned before in the Mishnah, that you can't read the Megillah backwards, because this would actually be reading the Megillah backwards. And you can't do that. So therefore, if you come in late, you have to start over again. All right. Then it says, misnamnim. What exactly is misnamnim? They were reading the Megillah in the shul. The guy was snoozing. Misnamnim. He was, in Yiddish they say he was dremling. He was snoozing. He wasn't fully asleep. He was chetzi. Like Mishnah is the Gemara is going to give you the exact definition. Heichidomi misnamnim. What are we dealing with? What does it mean when we say misnamnim? What are we doing? What is he misnamnim? Omar Rabashi, says Rabashi, nim v'loy nim, snoozing and not snoozing, tir v'loy tir, he's up and he's not up. Okay, does that help the definition? Snoozing and not snoozing, he's up and he's not up. But what I got, tir is Rashi means air, up. So he's snoozing and not up. And now the Gemara further articulates what it means. The korulei, if you call him v'ane, he responds. He's not so much asleep that he's not going to answer you. But when he has to use his mind to answer something, you ask him what time it is or what day is today. He says, "V'lo yoda lahaduri svara." He's not able to respond with logic. He's still asleep. He's not yet up. He can't respond logically. Lo yoda lahaduri svara. I'm not sure exactly if telling the time is a svara, or maybe it takes a little bit something more complex than that. But basically, you call him, he responds, but he cannot respond to you with an idea. But when you remind him, he says he remembers. If he doesn't remember, even if you remind him, he's still too much asleep. If he can answer you right away, then he's also, then he's not asleep at all. But if he doesn't know how to answer you logically, but when you remind him, that's the definition of misnah. Okay, that's what the Gemara says. Another halacha we learned in the Mishnah, that hoyo koisva, if he was writing it, so the person was writing a Megillah, or he was expounding the Megillah. He looks in the Megillah and he's expounding. When he's writing it, the Gemara is going to say, what does it mean he's writing it? He's writing it. How? And he's also reading the Megillah at the same time that he's writing a Megillah. Or he's expounding the Megillah, giving droshes on the Megillah. So he's reading the Megillah. Or Rumagiha. Or he's looking over the Megillah. So the Mishnah says, Im kiven liba yotza v'chulu. If you had in mind to fulfill the obligation of Megillah, then you fulfilled. Even though you didn't read just the Megillah in a regular way, you were just writing, expounding it, or looking it over. If you had in mind to do the mitzvah of the Megillah, yotza, you fulfilled your obligation. V'chulu. So the Gemara says, how are you doing it? It says you're writing it. We understand you expound it. When you expound it, that means the Megillah is already written. When you're looking it over, the Megillah is already written. So if when you're expounding it, you're reading the Megillah, or when you're looking it over, you're looking at the Megillah, so we can understand if you're reading the Megillah while you're looking it over, but you're writing it. But if you're writing it, that means that there is no Megillah yet. You're not really reading it from a Megillah, because right now you're writing it. So the Gemara says like this, Hey Chidami, what are we dealing about over here? Because of law, if he's organizing verse by verse, so he says, that's his reading of the Megillah, then he writes it down. That means he organizes it orally, verse by verse, and he writes it as he says it. And he wants to fulfill the reading of the Megillah because he said every single pasuk before he wrote it. But the Gemara says, how could you fulfill your obligation if you're not really reading it from Megillah? Because when you say the Megillah, you're saying it orally. You're not reading it in a ksab. You're saying it orally, and then you're writing it down. So you haven't read from a Megillah. How could that be okay? So why would it help, even if you have in mind to fulfill your obligation of the reading the Megillah? Who cares? Hey, Chidam. If he organizes verse by verse and then he writes it down, he organizes the verse orally because of law, and then you write it because of lay. And Bukatoni, and it says Yotza, that you fulfilled your obligation al yidei kriyas oisei sidur, that you fulfilled your obligation by that verses that you said, that you organized it orally, you fulfilled the obligation. Frag the Gemara, how could that be possible? Kikivan liba in my havi. What does it help me that you directed your mind, that you had in mind to read the Megillah, fulfill your obligation? Al pehu, This is orally, because when you were reading it, you didn't read it from a Megillah. You were reading it and then you were writing it down. Okay, so you're going to say he's not reading it orally before he writes down. First, he writes it down, and then he reads it. So first he writes down a pasuk, he reads it, writes another pasuk, and then reads it. But that means when he reads each pasuk, you don't have a full Megillah over there, because he hasn't written the end of the Megillah. You can't read from a Megillah that only has one pasuk, has 10 pasuk. You need a Megillah that has all the pasuk. So that's what the Gemara is saying. Elo the kosav psuka v'korele. But rather, you're going to say that he wrote verse by verse, and then he read it verse by verse. Did he then fulfill the obligation? How could the Mishnah say that he fulfilled the obligation? Didn't Rabbi Chelbe say in the name of Rabbi Chama Bar Guri, name of Rav, Halacha kidivrei ha'omer kula. He says the name of Rav, the halacha remains like the opinion who says you need to read the entire Megillah. This has to do with another disagreement. How much of the Megillah is one required to read? So he says the halacha is like the one that says you have to read the entire Megillah. Upligi, why is the halacha? What are the opinions here? Rashi says that there is a machloikes tanoi b'masnisin. The next Mishnah that we're going to learn that follows this, it says in the Mishnah over there, Mehechin koire odom es ha-Megillah. From where, we have the Megillah, where in the Megillah do we have to start reading the Megillah? So that he fulfills his obligation. Rabbi Meir Omer Kula. Rabbi Meir say its entirety. You have to read the whole Megillah. And Rabbi Yehuda says Mi Ish Yehudi, from Ish Yehudi. So basically, there is a disagreement. How much of the Megillah you have to read? Do we have to read the entire Megillah? Or it's sufficient to read from Ish Yehudi? But the Gemara says that's only a machloikis, how much of the Megillah we have to read. But there is no disagreement that we need a whole Megillah written. Even according to the opinion that says you read it from Ish Yehudi, still tzricha shedhei ksuba kula. It still needs to be all written. You can't have it partially written. Maybe you can get away by reading from Ish Yehudi, but you have to read from a kosher full Megillah. So since you're only reading it after you write pasuk by pasuk, you don't have a full Megillah yet. How could you fulfill your obligation? So what does it mean that he's reading it and he is doing the Megillah? The Gemara answers like this. Hello, we're talking on a situation that he has a kosher Megillah in front of him and he's reading from there out loud, and then he goes and writes it on the other Megillah. So he's actually reading from a Megillah, not orally. He's reading from a kosher Megillah, and from that Megillah, he's writing it to the other one. Hello, the mancha Megillah kamei. There is a Megillah laying in front of him. And he's reading from it verse by verse. Because of law, and he writes, Rashi, the mancha Megillah kamei, umatik mimenu. He's copying from it. He's copying from that Megillah, but he's reading it out loud from that Megillah. So he's saying Vayihi, writes Vayihi, Mechashvesh, or Pasuk, whatever. But he's saying the word and he's copying it. So the Gemara says, so here you see something else. We can learn from this another halacha that really a scribe, when he writes a Megillah, when he writes a Sefer Torah, soon we'll see about Tefillah Mezuzahs, he should never write out of memory. You should always write from another parchment. Because here you see that the only way we're interpreting the Mishnah, that it should be okay, is when the scribe did what? That he looked in one Megillah and wrote it to the other one. This is a support to the opinion that says that you should never write without looking into a writing, from a writing. Lema Mesayle le Rabba Bar Chana. Shall we say that this is a support for Rabba Bar Chana? So Masnisin de Katoni lo yot. Masnisin going yot. Since our Mishnah said you fulfilled your obligation, the only way we can talk our Mishnah is by when you're copying from the writing is Messiah Leila Rabba. So this is a support for Rabba. Rabba Baba Yochanan said the name Rabbi Yochanan. Osur lichtov ois achas shalom min aksam. That it's prohibited to even write one letter in the Sefer Torah, in the Megillah, if you don't look from the writing. Okay. So the Gemara says, it's not a proof. The Gemara says, Yuma, that perhaps the Isramile Isramuye. Maybe that's what happens. Who says that you can only write min aksav? Over there, we're talking about that particular person wrote it from the ksav, but you don't have evidence that you have to look in another sefer. Dilmo di Isramile Isramuye. That's where it happened over there. Dilmo di Isramile. So the Gemara says like this: La'olam. Really, I will tell you, mutar lichtoi b'loy hetek. You're actually allowed to write even if you're not copying. Umas nisin. Why is the Mishnah talking the case? The Isra'mele Megillah. He happened to come across a Megillah. Umaitik men and he's copying from it. So, and the Mishnah is telling you, he's telling to tell you that even though you are copying from the other Megillah, in Kiven Liba Yotze, if you had your mind that you're from again, you're Yotze. But it doesn't mean that the Mishnah holds that you have to have another Megillah in order before you write another Megillah. Okay, let's continue. So the Gemara Gufa. We're trying to get to the next Mishnah. Amar Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said name Rabbi Yochanan. Osur lichtov ois achas shaloi min aksav. We quoted before. He says we don't have a proof from our Mishnah, but he still says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that you're not allowed to write even one letter, not from looking into the writing. So I'll ask you a question. I challenge this. It says in the Braisa, Amar Rav Shimon ben Elazar, says Rav Shimon ben Elazar, Maise b'Rabbi Meir. There was a story with Rabbi Meir, Shaholach la'abir shona ba'asya. He went to make a leap year in Asya, in the city of Asya. So he went there. In order to make a leap year, you have to know, you have to go, you have to judgment. So he went to the city of Asya to make it a leap year there. The Megillah was Purim. He had no Megillah there. So what did he do? Because of Melibah V'Korah. So he wrote it from his heart, orally, and he read there. So here you see that he wrote a Megillah without copying from another Megillah. You said you're not allowed to even write one letter without copying from another Megillah. Amar Rabbi Abo, said Abo, Shani Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir has a different status. What is the reason that we don't want you to write only from the Ksav so you don't make a mistake? But when you have a great scholar such as Rabbi Meir, he knows the Torah so clearly and so well that he was different. He can write from memory. because he was qualified. Shandra Meir, he says the Mekayim Bey by him was fulfilled. This is a verse in Mishli, Perik Dalet. It says Va'afapecha. Fapecha refers to Torah. It's like Afapecha's Torah is like a blink of an eye, it will leave you. It talks about the Torah. Ya'ishiru kinekdach. They rest in front of you. Basically meaning that the Torah is in front of him all the time. Even when he's not looking into the Kisav, he has sort of a photogenic memory. He's actually seeing the letters as he's writing it. So he was an exception. That's why they allowed him. It said that. So he translated Rabbi Bar Choma, Rabbi Yehuda Medifte. Why does it mean your Torah will be next to your Elu Divrei Torah? Avapecha refers to Divrei Torah. By Torah it says, blink an eye, it's not there. If you stop learning Torah, even for an instant, you blink your eye, and it's not going to be there. If you fold your eye, means you close your eyelids, she will be forgotten for you. The Torah will be forgotten for you. Terrifying, like the blink of an eye. And still, but Rabbi Meir was straight, it was in front of him, it was direct by him, because the Torah, which is so precious that you might just blink an eye, lose it, but he was able to hold on to the Torah in a more powerful way. So the Gemara, Rab Chizda Ashkecha, Rab Chanano, Rab Chanina met Rab Chizda met Rab Chanano, Rab Kosa Svarim Shleim in Aksav. He was writing the Svarim not from looking in another writing. He was just writing it orally, writing a Megillah. In this case, not a Megillah, Svarim, Sefer Torah. Amar Lei, so he said to him, Ruya kol ha-Torah kula lichtav apicha. Really, the entire Torah is fit to be written by you. In other words, you're so learned, you have such a good memory. The Chachamim said, Asur lichtav is achas shleim in eksav. You're not allowed to. He said, the rabbi still said, you're not allowed to write even one letter, not from the Ksab. So, regardless of the fact that the Torah is you're so fluent in Torah, but still, the Chacham said you're not allowed to write even one letter, not from the writing. So the Gemara asked, since he was such a great scholar, that he told him that the whole Torah should be written to you, and we saw before by Rab Meir that if he was such a great scholar, it was okay. Me, the Omar. Since he tells him, Kol ha-Torah kulo ruya shetikotzav apicha, that the whole Torah is fit to be written by you, miklal, so from this you can derive the misharim metzlei, that they are straight by him, that he has it all. So, what Rameir Kosav, Rameir did write. So how come he's telling him not to write? The Gemara answers, Shasat Chakshan. In a case where you're pressured is different. The story with Rabbi Meir, he happened to be there, and there was no Megillah available. There's no Megillah available. What is he to do? So he wrote it from memory. But when you do have a Megillah in memory available, even a person who is so learned, like Rav Chananel, which he said that the whole Torah is worthy, he can transcribe the whole Torah, still he should not go ahead and do it by heart. And the exception was over there where he got stuck. He came to the city to be Ma'aber the year, and then they didn't have a Megillah. The Gemara says further on, Abaye Shora le Rabbi Bar Chovu. Abaye permitted Rabbi Lidvei Bar Chovu to the people of the Yeshiva Bar Chovu. He allowed them lemichtav tefillin u'mezuzos shleim eksav. He allowed them to write tefillin and mezuzos without looking in the paper. Tefillin and mezuzahs, of course, is a lot less than a Megillah, certainly a lot less than the Torah scroll, is a lot less to remember. So he allowed them to write, the people of Bar Chovu, to write tefillin and mezuzahs without looking in. Bar Chovu, sagt Rashi, Meicher tefillin habe. He was a salesman of tefillin. The tefillin of Bar Chovu were common. So the Gemara came on. Whose opinion does that follow? We didn't have such a distinction before. Before we said you're not even allowed to write one letter not from writing. And the Gemara says Gehaitana. This follows the opinion of this time. Tanya will learn the Braisa. Rav Yirmiyah says in the name of Rabbeinu, it must be from Yehuda Nossi, that tefillin and mezuzahs nichtobet shloi min aksav. Tefillin and mezuzahs you're allowed to write not from the writing. And another halacha is also ve'ein tzriches sirtut. Sirtut is those lines that you make by scratching into the parchment, so you write the neat lines. So he said two halachas. He says you can write it not by looking in, and also they don't require the sirtut, the engraving the lines there. But the Gemara says, the Gemara makes a split over here. The hilchasa, the halacha is, tefillin ain't tzrichim sirtut. Tefillin do not require that sirtut, but mezuzah is tzrichim sirtut. If you ever looked at mezuzah, you'll see that the mezuzahs do have that sirtut in them, and that is a requirement. The hilchasa, he says, kach halacha l'moshe Sinai, as halacha l'moshe Sinai. I mean, the law doesn't mean that one is right or not, but that's the law of l'moshe Sinai. But but they can both be written not min aksav. You don't have to look in. By timer, migras grisin. Migras grisin, the people know them already. It's migras grisin, Rashi shguris b'fi hakoil. They're common in everybody's mouth. People know them, so therefore you don't need to have a actual parchment to write it from there. You can just write it directly from the from memory. Okay, the next one, the Mishnah said, the various different, you wrote it, the Megillah, with various different kinds of ink. So he says like this, the Sam, Sam is Samo. And they say that Samo is yellow. That's a yellow color. And Rashi says, Zarnich beloshon hakodesh. Zarnich, urpuman nitu belaz. In Old French, I guess, it's yellow. Sikra, that's another color that the Mishnah mentioned. That's red. Omar Rabba Bar Chono, sakarto shemo. Sakarto is tzava odoim. Shetzovim boitrisim. The gutters, they used to use them, paint them red, the gutters. So that's the sakarto. What is kumus? These are all mentioned in the Mishnah. Sam, sikra, kumus. Kumus is kuma. Kuma is sap of a tree. I guess that's another writing material. And let's turn to Amud Beis. Kankantum. That's another thing that you can't write with. Charto de ushkifi. That's a color. Charto de ushkifi, Rashi says, it's a black. It's a sam shetzoivim boy min olim shchodim. It's a dye that they paint, they dye black shoes. That's the black. Diftera. Diftera is a parchment. The maliach, they work through the parchment. First they salt it. Kamiach, they soak it in water. But you hadn't used these agents that soften the. So Rashi says kamiach b'mayim, and below off it's moved ba'afotzim shekoidim glash. So basically, it's non-finished parchment. And the yar is machko. Machko is like paper. Machko minasubin osuyal de devek. It's grass made through paste. You paste it together. So the Mishnah said about all this before. Let's see, what did the Mishnah say? Lo yotzo. See? Hoyso ksuba besam besikra bekumus ubekankantum alan yorva la diftera. Lo yotzo. You have not fulfilled your obligation. Now, the Gemara explains first diftera and then the yor. So the diftera is unfinished parchment, and the yor is like paper. So you're not fulfilling the obligation. Acha take suba ashuris. It must be written in ashuris, in Hebrew. Why do we say it needs to be written in ashuris? The ksiv kichsovam should write it in their language. In the Megillah, it says you write it in the language of the Jews. Uchizmanu, in their writing, in their time. Ala sefer ubidyoy. It has to be on a parchment and with ink. How do we know that it has to be on a parchment with ink? We learned all the other. Where does it say this? All the other ones are no good. We say the other kinds. Minolam, how do we know this? The Gemara says, Osir ksiva ksiva. We have a gzera shava ksiva ksiva. The word ksiva, ksiv hocha in Esther, vatichtav Esther amalka. So she wrote, ksiv hosa miyirmin amdvov, vayomer lam baruch, nipi yikore Elias kol advorim, vayila. From his mouth is nani koisev ala sefer b'dyoy. So over there in Yirmiyah it says, I'm writing it on a sefer b'dyoy. So here you learn clearly that it's all done on a sefer b'dyoy. Okay, so we reached the other Mishnah, and my apologies, I'm going to finish early. I have the kids here, and there's a little bit tumult over here. So we'll leave it over here, and Mitzvah Shem will catch up next week. Perhaps next week we'll start 5 minutes before 7 o'clock. So we'll do it at 7:55, try to get in a full hour. In the meantime, say to everybody, good night. And hopefully see everybody. And if anybody wants to say something, now is your chance.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Right? And we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy your summer.